Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. So now it's official. Climate change is the biggest risk to the economy. The Bank of England has said so, putting it ahead of COVID and Brexit. And now the PRA has set out what firms need to do to deliver on this in their Dear CEO letter. Today is about looking at what needs to be done in response to the PRA challenge and the expected FCA guidance and how to go about doing it. It's a high-level look and the first of a number of sessions that we've got planned. For those who don't know me, I'm Richard Whale, a partner in BDO. I do a mix of financial services, internal audit and regulatory work, and environmental measurements. In days gone by, this was a slightly odd combination, but no longer. I am joined by my colleagues from the BDO ESG group, Adam Salou and Gloria Perez-Torres. Before we get started, I wanted to say from all at BDO, we hope that you and your respective teams and loved ones remain well during this difficult time. First, some housekeeping points. Today's webinar is going to be recorded and we'll circulate the slides later to all those participating. Your lines will be automatically muted throughout the whole webinar. If you want to submit questions to the panel throughout the section, then use the Q&A box at the bottom right-hand side of your screen. Please ensure if you're doing that you send the questions to all panelists, and we'll try to cover as many of these as we can at the end of the webinar. If you do find you're having any problems with the sound, let us know via the Q&A box. Awareness of the risks of climate change and the need to reduce global warming has been with us for a while, with increasing scientific and empirical evidence to back it up. The 2015 Paris Agreement took this a step further in getting it as part of government policy for all 194 signatories, or at least in theory anyway. The scene changed again last year with the PRA recognising the risk to firms and setting out expectations in SS 319 around making sure that they were taking account of the potential risks to financial stability and were adequately capitalised. The FCA also set out its expectation in broad terms in FS 19.6 in October last year. The latest message from the bank and regulators is different. It's as much about using firms to drive changes in business behaviour more widely to reduce climate change as it is for firms managing their own financial exposures or own emissions. For PRA regulated firms, the Dear CEO letter and the related guidance from the CFRF provide the expectations and a timetable for delivery. This is backed up with the message that the PRA is going to be making sure it happens. The FCA hasn't been as specific so far, but more guidance is expected in October, and it's likely to be along very similar lines. But despite all this guidance that's out there, this is no simple task for firms to take forward. This is not about a bolt-on that can be addressed by writing a nice policy or having some nice tick boxes on climate risk questions and things like that. Climate risk needs to be built into the strategic thinking, the risk management, the decision making and reporting of the firm. The pink and grey blobs on the slide that you can see. Climate risk could have big impacts on the likes of future returns on investment and the creditworthiness of businesses. 18 months is not a long time to make such fundamental changes. And as an added incentive, COVID has increased even more the scrutiny of firms' ESG practices. So any firms that are outliers may find that there's negative reputational consequences as well. And despite all the guidance out there, there's a lot of areas where it assumes the right sort of data is obtained and the right sort of measures have been used. But in a lot of cases, these don't even exist yet. Proportionality is also mentioned. But as ever, what does that really mean in this context? Therefore, at BDO, our ESG team is looking to try and help firms navigate this by providing some practical guidance and sharing practices and knowledge. We're using a mix of people who understand FS businesses, risk management, environmental measurement, and CSR to work things through and provide the help. We don't claim to have all the answers, and we know that practices will emerge over the next month, But by what we're doing ourselves, our own research, and keeping abreast of what others are doing, we can help firms to have confidence that what they're putting in place will work. Today, Gloria, who focuses on economic and green crime, will set out the overall roadmap for firms for meeting the Dear CEO letter over the next 18 months. Then Adam, from our governance team, will pick up on one of the first areas on the roadmap, getting the governance right, in a lot more detail. Then I'll pick up on some of the specific challenges that firms are facing and give you a chance to flag areas that you are concerned about. And we'll try to respond to as many of your questions as we can. Thank you for joining us, and we hope you find it helpful. You, Gloria.
Thank you, Richard. As you said, the next 18 months will be the period of time for firms to focus on implementing a climate change risk framework that should be fully embedded by the end of 2021. The question is, what do you need to do to ensure that you can deliver what the regulator wants? And the answer is planning. You need detailed planning and management to get the implementation right. For those who don't know me, my name is Gloria Perez Torres. I specialize in helping firms comply with regulatory requirements. I work with a range of small and medium-sized banks and financial institutions in the UK and abroad, helping them to develop and implement strategies on economic crime and ESG risk. Today, I am going to present a roadmap to meeting the requirements of the DRCO letter over the next 18 months or so. First, I'll be looking at where climate change risk management fits and the pillars on which the framework should be built on, followed by suggesting a 6-step roadmap to implementation. Even if a firm has already created an implementation plan or a framework, this roadmap can serve as a basis to consider whether your plans include the major steps or milestones needed to get the implementation right. So moving on, just in this slide, one of the first questions that come to mind is, where does climate change risk fit? We already know that climate risk should be integrated into the existing business-wide risk assessment framework. But where it fits better, it will be a business decision for each firm, and there are different options. One option, like in the slide, is to consider climate change risk within the broader ESG framework. In this case, ESG will be a standalone risk and climate change will be a component with it. But there are other options. The Climate Financial Risk Forum guide, for example, presents 3 options to treat climate risk. The first one is a standalone principal risk type. The second one is as a risk within other types of risk, like, for example, credit, operational, or liquidity. And the third is to include it in both within the existing risk types and as a principal risk. And this actually makes sense because climate risks are interlinked with other established risks, like, for example, credit or operational, like I said before, or even economic crime. And it is very important that these links will be clearly established and understood. Moving on to the next slide. We know the pillars on which the implementation plans should be developed because these have been clearly defined in the Bank of England's communications and the available guidance. And so the pillars are governance, risk management, scenario analysis, disclosure, and innovation. The governance pillar covers the new arrangements to ensure that there is effective board-level oversight, internal management, monitoring processes to manage the climate-related risks, and also opportunities. But Adam will explain later in detail what good governance of climate change risk should look like. The risk management pillar requires looking at risk factors. For example, products and services offered by a firm, and assessing the potential climate risk that may arise from more frequent and severe weather events. These are otherwise known as physical risks, as well as the necessary transition to a net zero carbon economy or transition risks, which include, for example, policy changes, shifts in market preferences, and also changes in technology. And it also requires the evaluation of actions that will need to be taken to mitigate this risk, and also capturing new opportunities or transformation opportunities, and the active choices that can be made to invest, for example, in more resilient or zero carbon solutions or green projects. Other factors that need to be considered are industry and geography. And for example, on geography, some countries are more vulnerable than others to climate change. And a guide that I have found very useful is the Notre Dame Global Adaptation Index, is the NDGA, which categorizes countries according to their vulnerability to climate change as a result of, for example, overcrowding or food insecurity, inadequate structure, and also civil conflict. The scenario analysis needs to be integrated into the broader risk assessment. Will require modeling and considering a range of possible scenarios to help you understand and manage future risks, and also the opportunities to support the transition to a net zero carbon economy. So I think that what is a sensible start is to identify material exposures, considering simple what-if scenarios before going into more complexity. And the disclosure pillar will cover all the public disclosures of the actions and outcomes that I just mentioned in the annual reports, and other climate risk reporting initiatives, and also on websites. And these disclosures are crucial because they will influence the decisions that consumers and investors will make, and also it will have an impact on the reputation of the firm. And then we have a fifth pillar, which is innovation, and this is not directly mentioned in the DRCO letter, but is in the Climate Financial Risk Forum guide. And the idea is for firms to consider climate and ESG tools and methods and approaches to help support the changes required to meet the climate goals. And this will include, for example, data innovation, staff training, and also industry collaboration. Moving on to the next slide. So the roadmap. The next question is, how are firms going to operationalize the pillars in the next 18 months? And realistically speaking, firms will need a very good plan that covers the process of establishing the scope, defining the objectives, and the steps to achieve them by the end of next year. So we have developed a roadmap which considers milestones and the deadline for implementing them on a quarterly basis. So basically, there will be 6 quarters, which will become 6 stages, 6 quarterly, 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 from now until December 2021 by when the framework will need to be embedded. Worth noting, our experience in helping firms implement the risk management frameworks has taught us that the key components interlay each other. So as a result, the roadmap is not a straight process of first governance, second risk assessment, etc. It's more like all the actions and the activities will interlay each other, and there will be a need to revisit related actions in the pillar more than once throughout the process. The first milestone. This is the development of an implementation plan that should be completed by the 30th of September, and it will be all about carefully planning the implementation stage. As with any project, the first step is creating a high-level visual summary that maps out the vision and the direction for implementing a framework by the deadline that the Bank of England has given us. I think it is important to think about what makes the difference between successful and unsuccessful change projects. And the most common mistake or the reason for a project to fail, in my experience, is unrealistic expectations and timeframes. So I think that the key is good planning, setting out clear and realistic goals and timelines, and ensuring that there is support from top management. To be successful, the implementation project will need to meet the business requirements, but also the PRA and the FCA expectations, and will need to be delivered and maintained on the schedule without delays within a pre-assigned budget, and it has to establish clearly the resources needed and the action owners. So this is why we have set out a potential high-level roadmap to know where we want to be at throughout the process. Also in the planning stage, it's very important to consider the governance responsibilities and oversight, which Adam is going to talk more about later, but also resources, budgets, identification of broad climate scenarios to use later in evaluation, and also the data requirements for later in the process. Reflecting on similar projects where there is a need for developing a specific expertise, I think that it's important that awareness training should be provided to all the stakeholders throughout the process. So at this stage, the first group to receive the training should be the board and some key managers. And then in the next stage, you can train other managers and so on and so forth until everybody in the firm is aware of the climate change risk and the impact and what is expected from them. Then the implementation starts after the planning phase, and it will cover setting the business vision and the strategic approach to climate change, which should be completed by the 31st of December 2020. Other actions to complete in this time are conducting high-level evaluations of the overall business strategy against the scenarios to establish broad climate change impacts, and also mapping those impacts to business activities. And also as part of the strategy, considering technology needs and innovation opportunities is important. From the end of Q4 2020 until March 2021, the idea is to focus on developing the risk management framework. So, for example, during this stage, work needs to be done on the risk assessment, including developing integrated thresholds and metrics that will allow the firm to assess whether it is performing within the set risk appetite, and setting out the 2020 year-end disclosures and other announcements, and consider an initial evaluation of the 2021 year-end disclosures. And I think that a good approach when the expertise is in the process of developing is to just initially focus on a small set of risks with the scope and sophistication increasing later. The next milestone has a deadline of 30th of June 2021. And during this stage, the firms can finalize the risk assessment, scenario analysis, the risk matrix, and also prepare the documentation supporting the framework, like the policies, procedures, guidance, and the forms. And also the first and second line monitoring plans. And this is also the last stage of the implementation phase, and an opportunity again to reconsider technology and the use of innovation tools. So then from June 30th, 2021, it will have to be business as usual. And this is a critical deadline because if you are in the right place at this time, you will most likely be able to work on embeddedness during the remaining 2 quarters until December. So policies should have been approved and rolled out, and also the procedures at this point. And this is also an opportunity to review performance and the alignment between the strategy and the risk appetite. Then, if firms haven't done so, this is a good time for obtaining assurance over the design and effectiveness of the framework. With this can be conducted by the third line of defense and the internal audit function. And if they don't have the skills in-house to consider, it's good to consider involving a specialist. But in practice, going forward, climate change and ESG should be a standing point in the internal audit plans for all firms. September 30th, 2021 will see the end of the first quarter of operation of business as usual activities, and the firm should take a moment to reflect and consider the lessons learned on the work already conducted, to agree on action plans for areas for further development, and see if management are happy with the monitoring reports and with all the MI that is being escalated to the board. So with this roadmap, what we are hoping to accomplish is that by December 31st, 2021, climate change activities should be fully embedded. During this quarter, firms should review and update the risk assessments and the 2020 risk appetite against the updated scenarios to be rolled out for 2022. And the last milestone will be making climate disclosures in the 2021 annual report and any other relevant publications which will happen around March 2022. And at this point, I don't want to disappoint everybody, but you haven't finished yet. There is still a lot to do in terms of ongoing monitoring to ensure that climate change and ESG controls are operating effectively from a design and operational perspective. And the framework will need to continuously improve as the expertise develops. So to conclude, I have just presented a high-level roadmap to meet the requirements of the DRCO letter over the next 18 months or so. And what I have proposed is a multi-layered strategic roadmap showing how major components of change, for example, people and processes and technology, would fit together within a broader ESG framework. This is to deliver a climate-related financial risk management strategy. And like Richard said, 18 months is not a long time, and firms will need to work strategically and quickly to build their understanding of the financial of the climate risk while implementing the framework. Now we'll pass it on to Adam, who is going to cover the governance aspect of the roadmap in detail.
Thank you, Gloria, and hello, everyone. A reminder, please do feel free to continue submitting questions as we go. We've had a couple so far, and we're making good progress through the content, so we should have time to take some more, and I may touch on a couple that have already come in throughout this next part of the webinar. So my name's Adam Salou, and my interest and focus on ESG-related matters, such as climate change, has been piqued primarily through working with some of our clients on governance, as well as stewardship considerations, such as the revised FRC Stewardship Code, which came into force in January this year. We've seen it places a lot more emphasis on ESG-related factors. But thinking about ESG and climate change governance more broadly, as Gloria mentioned, this is the first and arguably the most fundamental element of the roadmap for all financial services firms to consider before embarking on their ESG and climate change strategies. On this slide, I've highlighted 3 key stages of the governance process that need to occur in order for firms to have a chance of successfully implementing a climate change strategy. And these 3 stages also align with the roadmap that Gloria has just presented, but it also sets a basis for change and foundation for good climate change governance in the long run. So the first stage is boards defining climate change strategies, and we've seen a broad range of progress in relation to this, and no doubt there'll be a range of how much progress has been made at the firms represented within the virtual room here this morning. Some firms will already have defined climate change strategies, which they have been reporting on regularly. Others will not have started to consider it. But regardless of where firms are at, these considerations will either need to be initiated or revisited, given the increasing regulatory guidance on expectations of firms. As has been mentioned, defining strategy is key, not only in relation to just managing climate-related risks and meeting regulatory expectations, but also to identify opportunities in your respective markets. Now, in times gone by, we've heard firms with the mindset that regulatory change is an opportunity. So there's some of the industry-specific examples like MiFID II, Insurance Distribution Directive, Solvency II. There's a good mindset for firms to have to see this as an opportunity. But, in our opinion, this is even more prevalent now in relation to climate change, that there are as many opportunities and upsides than potential risks. The next stage is implementation of the climate change strategies, and project and program governance should be defined in relation to climate change projects, as well as potentially other ESG-related projects, if that's where climate change will fit within your firm's governance and risk management framework, as Gloria mentioned. Given the scale of the task at hand, good governance and oversight structures are required so that boards can gain assurance that climate change strategies will be embedded as intended and within the required timescales. Climate and ESG projects, therefore, must be given airtime at board and ExCo meetings. Climate and ESG projects shouldn't be just looked at by a small team or project team in silos without robust challenge and oversight. We know that boards and ExCo agendas are very full at the moment, but a customary 5-minute verbal update will no longer be sufficient if firms are to meet the regulatory timeline and expectations in relation to climate change. The final stage is the embedding of strategies. As with all projects, once implemented, governance and risk management structures will need to remain in place, and processes will need to be applied consistently to ensure adherence to climate change strategy over time. As has been alluded to already in this webinar, climate change risk is likely to have a longer time horizon than other risks on top of firms' risk registers. Therefore, despite the regulatory requirements applying from the end of next year, it still may be several years before risks crystallize. So we really are looking about talking about setting up a basis and governance structure for the long run. So what needs to be considered from a governance perspective? Here I've listed some of the key governance considerations across the three-stage governance timeline that I just outlined, and some of which Richard mentioned earlier. And also these are the key topics and themes that we've pulled out of the various industry guidance, the Joint Climate Financial Risk Forum Guide, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and other international guidance around climate change. The regulator's approach to climate risk could be comparable to topics such as conduct risk, in which the FCA infer that the most effective conduct risk frameworks are those that are embedded into existing risk management frameworks and are embedded into all levels of an organisation. The CFRF guide states that an indicator of the quality of a firm's climate risk governance could be the extent to which climate risk management is integrated within existing risk management frameworks, and hence my analogy here. So I'll just delve a bit deeper into a couple of the areas of governance that we think are the most relevant and make the biggest difference. The first here is board oversight, and as mentioned, if not already done so, boards must start to consult on their firm's climate change strategy and associated risk management approach. Boards are ultimately accountable to shareholders for the long-term health of organisations, and this includes the potential impacts of climate change. Failure to consider this may be deemed as a breach of directors' duties, and therefore some initial questions to consider and for boards to ask themselves are questions such as, to what extent are climate change risks and opportunities incorporated into existing governance and risk management frameworks? So as I've already mentioned, if they're not, then discussion needs to be initiated as to embedding those. Is the board sufficiently knowledgeable about climate change? And if not, should external expertise be sought? Has the board received updates or reports on the firm's approach to climate change and other ESG matters? And final example, is it clear who within the senior management team is responsible for identifying risks and opportunities related to climate change? And then the next stage there, who is responsible for managing the risks or realising the opportunities presented by climate change? Once these initial questions have been addressed, the next step is for boards to decide how to monitor the implementation of climate change strategy and risk management, whilst at all times considering the legal and regulatory expectations. So this should include regular reporting on the climate change project's progress between at least now and the end of next year. So as mentioned, if this is not already being done, then consideration needs to be given to get this on the board's agenda and receive regular updates on this. As part of the climate change strategy implementation, consideration should be given on how to educate all levels of the organisation as to the importance and awareness required to mitigate climate change risk. And this is very much the top-down embedding of strategies and values within an organisation. So a fundamental element of good governance. Climate change is certainly an issue that everyone in the workplace can have an impact on. For example, if your firm decides to set a target of net zero carbon emissions by a certain date, how are employees encouraged and potentially incentivized to contribute to this? How is an employee's contribution to the firm's overall objectives related to climate change and ESG factors monitored? Are printing statistics tracked? Is energy usage tracked? Will these results feed into performance appraisals? And these sort of questions, this is why, as always, appropriate governance and oversight is an essential overlay to ensure the embedding of a climate change strategy. So trying to mitigate the risk that a board sets an appropriate strategy, but it just fails to be embedded throughout the organisation. Moving on to the next consideration here, so risk appetite and tolerances. And this governance consideration is likely to evolve as climate change projects progress, because in order to devise appropriate risk appetite and tolerances and metrics, in-depth risk assessments will need to have taken place. For PRA regulated firms, the use of scenario analysis and climate stress tests will be regulatory requirement, which was confirmed in the recent BSEO letter from the PRA. Whilst this has not yet been confirmed for FCA firms, it is hard to see how thorough climate change risk assessments can be conducted without scenario analysis and stress testing. So FCA firms should also consider conducting the scenario analysis and stress testing too. It is also important that firms take time to devise risk appetite, the tolerances, and the metrics that can be used in the long term. And this is because these metrics are likely to translate into the climate disclosures that firms are or will be making. And the CFRF guide and other industry guidance cites consistency of metrics and disclosures as an important factor. Firms don't want to risk being accused of greenwashing by changing and cherry picking metrics and disclosures used to report on climate change. And greenwashing is a term growing in population, and we mean the process of conveying false or potentially misleading information about how a company's products are more environmentally sound. Metrics should be both an assessment of past performance, so for example, the amount of carbon emissions during a period, and forward-looking, such as climate value at risk of portfolios or assets, for example. In terms of translating metrics into public disclosures, the TCFD, as mentioned, have issued a wealth of content and examples of good practice disclosures and reporting. And there are various examples for different financial services sectors, and there also is some comment there on proportionality, as well as an identification or acknowledgement that for smaller firms, some of the publicly available information and disclosures just isn't there at the moment. So the TCFD are really trying to push industry consensus here and more public disclosure and reporting to increase the visibility and transparency of disclosures across the sector. Those TCFD, the TCFD initiative, there's 7 principles of climate-related disclosures and what they should be, in that they should represent relevant information, they should be specific and complete, they should be clear, balanced and understandable, they should be consistent over time, they should be comparable among companies within a sector, industry or portfolio, they should be reliable, verifiable and objective, and they should be provided on a timely basis. And also the TCFD, they refer to different scope types, so scope 1 and scope 2, scope 3 disclosures, and that's in terms of direct and indirect emissions. So for example, in 2020, a firm may say, well, we've reduced our carbon emissions by over 50% or 75%, for example, but that's because all the employees have been working from home. So are the indirect exposures also being captured? I'll now pass back on to Richard to discuss some of the key challenges with implementing climate change strategies, and in doing so, meeting the regulatory expectations.
Thanks, Adam. So, as I mentioned, whilst the guidance is plentiful, there's actually a lot of unknowns, and I think the biggest challenges overall are going to be filling in the gaps in knowledge and evaluating what it actually means for individual firms. The slide shows some of the questions that are out there, and the questions that we're getting through reinforce some of these messages and also raise some other points. From the discussions so far that we've had, for some firms, some climate risks seem pretty easy to identify, particularly where there are long-term credit exposures or investments or the associated vice over a long-term period. For others, the risk might seem more remote, where the products are short-term and not directly related to asset values. However, when you start to do the detailed evaluation, it is clear that no firm is going to be immune from climate risks, although the speed and severity of the impact might vary. A factor that we can't ignore is that this is an area that's key to UK and global policy making now. And so if these regulations don't achieve the right aims, then the likelihood is there will be further regulations to drive this forward, so exaggerating the climate impact. You know, this is not going to be something that is optional. Dealing with the unknowns will require a bit more than just monitoring what the PRA, FCA, and CFRF are putting out. It requires a more in-depth consideration of what the firm is doing and the specific impacts that climate change will have on that firm and that firm on climate change. And the outcomes of the climate risk evaluation will vary a lot between entities, as will the strategies that they want to take. And at BDO, we've been looking at these areas to try and provide areas of support. The sort of way that we are looking to support is through four things. So the first is around developing frameworks, tools and approaches for carrying out the key stages of the roadmap. So this is to help steer firms through the steps they need to go to provide them structure and confidence that what they're doing is not out of line with others. And there'll be a constant refining. So for example, around that, some of this is the high-level risk assessment tools for understanding how climate change impacts individual firms. The second is about looking at what the public information is that's available and considering how useful it is to support firms. While the biggest of you will be able to go out there and commission your own research into climate impacts, for most that's just not going to be practical. Therefore, it's about looking what is out there. And as Gloria mentioned earlier, there is quite a lot. And then focusing that down to fit into your firm. And then what we're doing is supporting firms directly in carrying out parts of their analysis. So some of that's about facilitation of sessions or review of specific areas or actually reviewing assessments that are being carried out, all again with the aim of sort of giving that independent challenge. And then finally, it's about the training side, providing training for boards and project teams so that they build the understanding of what they need to do and can talk sensibly about this, both within their organisations and to regulators. And we're going to be running further webinars to share some of these practices more widely over the coming months. Very high on that is the list of priorities is a selection and application of scenarios. So pleased that we've been getting quite a number of questions coming through. So let's use the remaining time to pick up on some of those that have been coming in. We won't be able to cover them all, but hopefully we can cover a lot of those. So first one that I will pick up is, given all the changes going on with COVID, is it realistic to expect the board to focus on climate change in 2020? Gloria, do you want to pick up that one?
Yes, of course. I guess that this question will be in a lot of people's minds, and climate change risk management is something relatively new, and as with many major developments, it is always a challenge. And many firms are already busy trying to overcome the challenges of adapting to working remotely. But the PRA, from the PRA and the FCA's perspective, this is not something new. And from the guidance issued last year, they are expecting that firms will have already made arrangements. And in the DRCO letter, they said that the end of 2021 represented more than 2.5 years since the publication of the Supervisory Statement 319. So in reality, if firms are going to be ready for the end of 2021, they need to be pressing on now. And most firms are reconsidering strategies in the light of COVID-19 and other social factors. So in many ways, it is an ideal time to include climate in the mix.
Okay, thank you very much. So next one, I think we've got a couple of questions that overlap here. So we've got one that relates to we don't believe climate change will materially affect our strategy, therefore why do we need to take action? And then we have got another one which is about what is meant by proportionality. We're a small wholesale firm without long-term commitments. So Adam, maybe you could answer those two.
Yeah, happy to take those. And yeah, that's certainly well, both of those questions are ones we've had previously. And I think in summary, climate change and climate change regulation, it is coming regardless of business model or even FS industry. As with other legislation, such as financial crime legislation, the indication is that regulators will still expect firms to have gone through thorough and robust risk assessments and scenario analysis, for example, to conclude the extent to which climate will affect their business. And if that's that it currently is not a current risk to the business, it may be an emerging one. It's having the risk assessment and the evidence that it's been considered to evidence that current conclusion that the firm has. Additionally, it's highly likely that internally facing climate-related disclosures will be required of financial services firms to report on how they are conducting their business in an environmentally friendly manner. So, for example, reporting on carbon emissions. So I guess that's agnostic of strategy. That's how businesses will conduct activities in an environmentally friendly way. I hope that answered the questions there.
Okay. Move on to the next one. How does this requirement fit in with the UN Global Compact SDGs? Gloria?
Well, I think that it is totally consistent. The UN Compact is not just for financial services firms, but is about wider thinking. And the UN Compact goes wider than just focusing on financial exposure. Like, for example, they have the goals, the sustainable goals of business to implement responsible investments, and which will be essential to achieving a transformation through the SDGs. And also, these align with the Paris Agreement and the Global Compact 10 principles, which seek to change the way in which business used to operate, and basically covers aspects of ESG, like, for example, human rights protection, making sure that firms are not complicit in any human rights abuses, and also ensuring that they don't get engaged in any forms of forced labor, and also making sure that there are anti-corruption measures to prevent, bribery and contributing to crisis in different sectors and countries. So yeah, I think this is totally consistent, and all these approaches really have a lot of commonalities in them. Yeah, I hope that's my perspective.
Okay, thank you. So a couple more governance questions coming up here. So one is about our firm is a UK subsidiary of an overseas firm. Our parent is driving the overall strategy and has its own approach to handling climate risk, which we need to be part of. To what extent can we just follow that? And we've also got a question about how do we see small standardized foreign banks approaching the CRFR? Adam, do you want to pick those up?
Yeah, I'll try and answer them together. I think there's a theme there. So I guess it depends on how the approach in the parent firm jurisdiction aligns to the UK requirements. And I think given the international alignment here, that the Paris Agreement, for example, apart from the USA currently, but I think in time they'll be encouraged because of the commercial aspect. I think the US firms will follow suit anyway, regardless of the politics there. But UK entities need to be able to demonstrate they've taken this into account and developed an appropriate approach. So I guess it's first consulting the alignment between the policies in the parent jurisdiction and in the UK. And then we would expect the UK entity to follow the parent firm approach in terms of strategy, as far as that's feasible, but they will also need to demonstrate they've considered any UK entity specific risks associated with the business model. So, for branches, for example, as I said, the strategy will be driven by the firm, but they need to show how they've dealt with climate risk locally, such as local credit risk considerations relating to climate change risks.
Okay. So next question to pick up, quite a broad one here. What information is there to support the evaluation of physical risks from a climate perspective? I think in terms of that, the short answer is absolutely lots of it. The problem is there's too much of it. So when you start searching for such information, there are lots and lots of studies that are out there, lots and lots of information, but virtually none of it directly relates to what you're trying to achieve. So you can't actually look at things to say, oh, right, well, we're working with manufacturing firms in Turkey. What sort of impact might this have? There just isn't that sort of information. There's the information on the broad scenarios, which the main guidance that the regulators is using, and I think that's really how I think things will develop. So it's getting the understanding initially in terms of which of the things that climate is likely to impact, whether that's positively or negatively, and then it's about digging a little bit more deeply in terms of the countries, the types of products, the industries that are being carried out as to what those impacts may be. And certainly from the work that we've done, we've been able to pull out some useful guidance amongst it if you can build it into a model to do it. I would imagine over time that there will be more directly related things being developed, and I think where firms have got heavy exposures in particular areas, then that's one where it might be worthwhile trying to do some direct research. Okay, we've just got time for one more, so picking up on that. So do we see climate risks as being an emerging risk or a current risk for the way it should be treated by firms? Adam, sounds like one for you.
Yeah. Well, you know, in most cases, I think it still is an emerging risk. Obviously, if firms are conducting their risk assessments and their business model is particularly susceptible to some of the potential impacts of climate change on their strategy, then it may, you know, become more as a current risk. But I think, you know, as we said, there's a longer term horizon here. You know, even for example, the carbon emissions targets in the UK, you know, extend, you know, years way beyond what we typically expect firms' risk appetite and risk register to cover. So it is unique in that sense that, you know, the regulation is bringing a risk onto risk registers and firms' radar that is potentially long term, but, you know, the requirement is to continually assess that and ensure that when the impacts of climate change start to crystallise, firms are well prepared to deal with that.
Okay. And then just one last one that's come through, because I think this actually sweeps up a number of things together. So when discussing proportionality, is it acceptable for smaller firms to concentrate on effective risk management that they can control, such as paper usage, cycle schemes, power supply, etc., rather than the carbon emission analysis? I think in terms of that, you've got to do the assessment about how the products and services that your firm's involved in relates to the climate risk more generally. And if you've done the risk assessments and actually it has very little impact out there because it's all very short-term products, or it's avoiding industries that are subject to change or high emissions, you can probably focus more on yourself. But if you've got exposures within that, then I think the proportionality approach is very much, you need to be looking at what impact your products are having. So we're now coming to the end of our webinar, and I wanted to share some final thoughts for you. I am conscious, despite the gallop through, we haven't had time to answer everybody's questions today, but we will look to pick out the outstanding ones directly with people following the webinar. Thank you for submitting some interesting and excellent questions. As mentioned earlier, we will be sending a copy of the slides out over the next coming days. Can I also mention that for any NEDs in the audience, we have a climate governance webinar for NEDs on the 8th of September, which we're running in conjunction with Chapter 0. So if anybody would like to be invited to that, then please contact Lauren Hughes, who can make the arrangements for that. Finally, I'd just like to thank Adam and Gloria for presenting today, and all of you for joining us this morning, and wish you a safe and good rest of your day.